welcome back to Worth Your Time podcast. I'm Erica, and today I'm speaking with Amanda Opelt. Thank you so much for joining me, Amanda.
Hey, Erica, it's really nice to be on with you. Thanks.
Did I say your last name right?
You did. I'm so impressed.
Yes.
Yeah, people think it's Irish, like
Oh,
Opelt, like with an apostrophe, but it's actually a
I
German.
just decided to go for it. I'm glad it worked out.
Well, you did it so confident. Like, yeah, I was like, wow, maybe she like did a research or
I
what.
could, yeah, I should have. I'm not that advanced. Well, Amanda, you caught my attention because of a book that you're writing, and just sort of, I think we have a lot of, kind of people in common in the world of social media and the Christian world and things like that. But tell us a little bit about who you are and about your upcoming book that's coming out.
Sure. Yeah, so I live here in Boone, North Carolina, a small town in Southern Appalachia. I was raised in East Tennessee. Lived in different parts of the world for a while, but really feel kind of at home in the mountains. And married to a great guy, Tim, and we have two little girls, 3 and 1. So I'm so appreciative of all the great work you put out there, Erica, on just being invested in your family and while investing in the church and in your own faith and in your creativity and just the balance that requires. So I've spent the last 15 years working kind of in either a social work setting or the humanitarian aid sector. And so just in the last year have transitioned over to writing, so that I can, have a little more flexibility to be with my girls and kind of explore my creative work a little bit more intentionally. And so, still, man, feels like it's moving kind of fast. About a year ago, I signed a contract for my first book, and it's coming out in July. I think it's July 19th this summer. And the book is called A Hole in the World, Finding Hope Through Rituals of Grief and Healing. And it's based on a quote by the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. And the quote is, "When you died, you left a hole in the world that I kept circling around during the day and falling into at night." And essentially, it's a book about grief, and it's a book about the way generations past have embraced communal rituals to help them process their losses and process their sorrow, and how I felt kind of a lack of ritual in my life when I walked through a season of significant grief, a series of losses, and just didn't really know how to process it, didn't know what to do with my emotions, didn't know how to interact with people when I was grieving, didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. And I just kind of became compelled by kind of how generations past in history have handled grief. You know how your phone, how like the algorithm just knows what's going on in your life, like your
Yes.
phone listens to you or whatever. I guess my phone knew I was grieving because somewhere on my news feed or Facebook feed, it popped up an article about strange grief rituals from the past. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I click on it, and it was like, that started me on a journey. And so I kept Googling things and checking out books from the library and just reading and reading and reading. And then I began journaling about it. And that's kind of how the book came to be, I guess.
Well, I love that sort of like sidestep into your creative process, just because I think we all know that feeling of you get like this nugget of an idea, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden like, wait, this could like be something more than this thought in my head.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's really cool.
Other than just me,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. And so writing about grief, like I can imagine that is really hard, especially writing about your own grief, because you have to go back to that place. You have to go back to those like awful moments. So how did you decide you wanted to do that? And how was it actually processing it like that?
right. That's a good question. And I still wonder sometimes if it was the right thing to do, to be honest with you, because I at least I began kind of sketching out my thoughts pretty soon in the immediate aftermath of, the loss of my grandmother, 3 miscarriages, and really culminating in the very sudden death of my sister, who was young, healthy, had 2 small children. Just one of those catastrophic life events
Mm-hmm.
for me and my whole family. And so um, I still wonder sometimes, should I have given it time? Should I have allowed myself the space to grow in wisdom a bit more as it relates to grief before I began writing? Um, but at the same time, like, my hope is that the words are raw and honest enough that they might meet someone else who's still in that same place of processing. And yeah, it is, in some ways, it was a hard decision, because it's like, okay, I'm going to write a book about grief, but that means I'm going to be talking about grief for a long time. It means I'm going to be having people share with me their own grief stories, and am I ready to hold those stories with people? And ultimately, I just decided it was worth it. And another thing that I discovered while writing the book, it wasn't just discovering this amazing, fascinating history of healthy grieving rituals. I discovered a lot about what the Bible has to say about sorrow and loss and anxiety and anger and all those feelings that come with grief. I discovered a lot of that too. And things that just weren't talked about maybe as openly in the church as I think they should have been. And so I felt like I was kind of rediscovering the Bible in some ways. And I
Mm-hmm.
felt really excited about wanting to share that too. So I just decided it was kind of worth the risk. And there are some days where I think this is a bad idea. But most days I am really grateful for the opportunity to do it. I'm grateful that anyone would want to have a conversation with me. I'm like, the fact that you want to have a conversation with me about this is an honor and an excitement for me. So um so yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting what you say about like rediscovering the Bible, because I think there's, grief being one of the things, like the way the Bible is, it's like a living word. And so
Yeah.
there's always new things that we can glean from it, depending on sort of like the angle that we're coming from.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's interesting to, I'm sure you read lots of the Bible before that, but
Yeah.
to come to it in this state, it's almost like God can like he like tilts the scripture, or whatever, he gives you this new vision of what he's saying to apply to your life as it is now. So that's a really interesting thing. I was also going to ask you this, with your sister, who is Rachel Held Evans, who very well-known writer. That's, you were grieving, of course, your personal grief, but then so many other people were grieving around you,
Right.
because it was such a shock. It was like a national news story. And so how was it to, I guess, grieve personally while like all these other people were also grieving, but like in a less personal way?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I've thought a lot about it, because it's a hard question to answer. I'll say this: by and large, for the most part, I am so grateful for the love and the kindness and the generosity of Rachel's readers, the people who loved her the way they loved us well from a distance, even though we didn't know them. We got hundreds of cards in the mail, and I read every single one of them. It took me a long time. I couldn't do it right away. I just Every sympathy card you open is a reminder that she's
Mhm.
really gone, that this is real, this is really happening. But about a year after she died, I started reading through the cards, and people were just so. I think what was beautiful to me is that people spoke of their own grief, but they were always so generous to elevate our grief more than their own, if that makes sense,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
recognize that we weren't grieving Rachel Held Evans, the New York Times bestselling author. We
Right.
were grieving Rach, my sister, the person I grew up with, the person I plan to grow old with, the mother of my niece and nephew. And in some ways, it's like, I think a lot of people, when they lose a loved one, they think, man, I wish the world just knew. I wish the whole world could know what a wonderful person she was. And we have this incredible blessing of knowing that so many people knew how beautiful and brilliant and creative and generous she was. And, my brother-in-law likes to say there are people that are not even born yet that will read her work and be blessed by her work. And so that's a huge privilege and a huge blessing. At the same time, there's complexities that come with that, and just kind of feeling like, I don't know, sometimes we can think of grief as a little bit of a pie. In some ways, it's like, I need this piece of the pie, like we can kind of hoard our grief in
Mhm.
some ways, but there's enough space in the world for us all to grieve together, if that makes sense. Like, someone
Yeah.
else's grief doesn't diminish
It
my
doesn't,
own.
yeah, it doesn't have a box. It doesn't have constraints.
Right, exactly. But there are certainly moments where I'll see someone say, like, I miss her voice on Twitter, and I'm like, oh man, I wish that was all I missed. I wish I was just missing her voice on Twitter. And instead it's like, I'm missing her at Christmas. I'm missing her when
Mhm.
I have good news and I can't share her. I missed her at the birth of my daughter, who she will never know. And so I think there's complex feelings there, but for the most part, it's been such a blessing to be supported and loved by the people that loved her.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
One of the other things that you talk about is going through miscarriages. And I want to ask a little bit about that, just because so many women know what it's like to go through that experience. I
Right.
mean, it's so,
Yeah.
so common.
Right.
And I guess what I want to ask is just, it's a weird thing, because so many times it's hidden and nobody even knows that it's happened, because a lot of
Right.
times people don't even talk about their pregnancies until second trimester.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like, well, some people name them, some people don't. And it's just kind of this weird space. And so
Right.
I do you think that we could do, I think as a society, we could do a better job supporting women through these things.
Right.
But I guess I'm not sure what I'm asking, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, and there's even, I think part of the reason it may be taboo in some ways is, like, there's kind of the culture's divided a little bit on personhood, and like,
Yes. Yeah.
when is a life and when is it viable, and but you really don't want to get into all that when you're in the
Right.
midst of grieving a devastated, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
You're like, I'm not
yeah,
into abortion
not going,
politics right now.
we're not talking politics right now. I'm crushed. I lost my baby, and
Mhm.
that a lot of what grief is grieving a hoped for future that you never
Mhm.
reach. And I think about when you lose a loved one, like when I lost my grandmother or my sister, is like, you have this whole history with the person that you're grieving, and you knew them, and it's more tangible. But with a pregnancy loss, it's what it is. It's the hope of a future with someone you don't even know. You don't, it's like you don't even know who it is that you're grieving.
Yeah.
And so that, I think it was kind of, and yeah, just I'll be transparent about kind of what my experience was like. I lost my first baby in it was a silent miscarriage. So, you go in for a routine ultrasound, there's no heartbeat. So I go back like 5 days in a row and have them check. You know what I mean? I'm like, just make sure, make sure, make sure. And
Yeah.
even my untrained eye could see on the ultrasound, and I knew in my gut. But that was a strange experience, to be like, I'm still pregnant, but I'm not pregnant. It's like, there's this feeling of kind of your body betraying you a little bit, like you can't trust your body. And
Mm.
then pregnancies from there on out are always going to be pretty riddled with anxiety, because you don't know if your body's going to do this thing. They say pregnancy and childbirth is the most natural thing in the world, and it's like, well, why didn't it work for me?
Mhm.
um and so I think that's part of the confusion of it, is it's a death that happens within your body. It's grieving someone you never knew. And I in all my study of rituals, I had a hard time finding um, rituals about pregnancy loss. It's like, throughout
Yes.
history, we've not known what to do about this.
I
Um,
wrote an article a couple years ago about, like, it was more about late term loss and stillbirth, but I agree. Like, I was trying to find that information just for the article, and there was just very little out there.
Yeah, right, right. And one thing I'll say, I don't know if this will quite answer your question, but one thing that really helped me is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Old Testament scholar John Walton. He writes kind of about the context of in which Genesis was written, the
Mm.
question that people would have been asking, and some of that ancient Near Eastern thought that influenced the writing of the Old Testament. And he talks about how in the curse of Genesis 3, when God says, that you'll experience much pain in childbearing, and with great pain, you'll bring forth children. One of the words that's used for that term childbearing, it's not just labor and delivery. The word actually means the whole process of reproduction will
Mm.
be painful for you. And for some reason, I think that helped me to know that like, okay, even God recognizes this, that it's not just that moment of, because to me, by the time I got to labor and delivery, I was so glad that my baby had made it that far, that I was like, this is awesome. I don't even care about the pain. I'm just so happy we've made it this far.
Yes. Yeah.
But God actually speaks to the pain of the whole process of like hoping for a baby, trying for a baby, infertility, pregnancy loss, the actual birth, and then the raising of children. There's something kind of holistic about that term that's used in Genesis 3. So I don't know, that for some reason helped me and made me feel seen by God in all of it. And that was enough for me. I was like,
Yeah.
if society doesn't see me, but I feel like God sees me, then maybe I'll be okay.
Yeah, I've never heard that before. I do feel like that could be helpful to people maybe that are
Yeah.
listening. It makes me think of, I when I was pregnant the first time, I was like I didn't even have a reason to be terrified, but I was like the whole first
Really?
trimester, I was just every day. So I was like, I just want to, can I go in like every day and check? I didn't.
Yeah, totally. 100%. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's,
that's how I felt. And then once I got to second trimester, I thought I would feel better, but I didn't. I was like still scared.
yeah.
And, so you get all the way through, and then I have my baby. And then I was like, oh, like your fear doesn't actually end. Like I
No.
had really bad postpartum anxiety with my first.
Okay.
And so, that of course dissipated, but I was like, oh, this is like your whole world has changed.
Yep.
Like you cannot look at the world the same way. Like everything is a little scarier. Everything is, I don't know. It's like so many people can explain motherhood and, maybe it sounds cliche, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's so true how there is a hardship or it's almost like you love them so much that
Yeah.
it, it is painful almost sometimes.
That's so well articulated, Erica, because it is, with great love comes great cost. Like no great love comes without some cost, I think. And I've learned that in grief, where there's great love, there will be great grief. This is how this ends. When there's love, somebody is gonna die. Like we're all mortal,
Yeah.
and you yeah, it's true about motherhood, is that with motherhood comes kind of a loss of autonomy. Like you feel like part of your body is living outside of you and
Mhm.
doing it without, outside of your control in so many ways. And you just have to learn to kind of live, like you go to bed with that fear every night and you wake up with that fear every night. But that's because your love for them is great. It's an indication of how strong the love is. And it's really beautiful and awful at the same time.
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, don't get me started. Well, I want to ask you about a couple other things. So you were a humanitarian aid worker. Tell us a little bit about that. And in that, there's a different kind of grief that you're going to walk through there, because it's not yours necessarily, but you're seeing it in the lives of other people. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that part of your life.
Yeah. I always feel a little bit like I need to make a disclaimer that I wasn't an actual aid worker. I guess I was. I worked for a humanitarian aid organization. I was a staff care chaplain, essentially. Like I kind of helped manage staff care programs for folks that lived and worked overseas doing humanitarian aid work. And so in some ways it was like, yeah, I went to a lot of those places and saw a lot of those tragedies, and have been to, areas of famine and war and things like that. Saw them myself, but also kind of helped carry the stories of the aid workers that were living there day in and day out and kind of
Mhm.
wrestling with what they were seeing. And so, yeah, that concept of secondary trauma of, you bear witness to the trauma of others. And so, how do you process that? How do you live with that? It's kind of it's an interesting, it was an interesting life to live for about 10 years, to where you fly into, you know, the a war zone, or a place where a hurricane has completely devastated everything, and you throw your heart and soul into the work for 2 weeks, and then you get on a plane and you come back, and
Yeah.
it's like you go to a Christmas party, or
Yeah.
you go and you go
Weird.
to the grocery store, and you have this, so this kind of these two worlds kind of colliding, and figuring out how to hold those two places in your brain space. My dad talks about the verse. I'm going to show, this does not do my Awana girl's heart good. I cannot remember the reference. It's Philippians, right? I've learned the secret of living in plenty and in want.
Mm,
And he says most people think that the real kind of power of that verse is like, oh, I've learned how to live in want. I've learned how to live in times of suffering and in need, and I've learned how to be happy. He said, I think aid workers need to learn the secret of living in plenty too. How,
mm,
how do I enjoy when I've been exposed to such great loss? How can I be thankful for and savor and enjoy the blessings that I'm privileged to have? And it's tough work, and I wasn't really one of them. I feel like I supported aid workers, but when all the rest of us are sitting at home thinking someone should do something about Ukraine, or someone should do something about, Afghanistan or Iraq, or, those folks are going in there and risking their lives to help. And it is heavy burdens they carry for the rest of their
yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I am in awe of people that do that for their life's work. Where are some of the countries that you were at? Just curious.
I spent some time on my own, kind of right after college, in India, and worked with some local uh, uh, Indian organizations there, doing teaching English as a second language, helping them with some fundraising, and that was really kind of where I cut my teeth a little bit, like cross culturally, like it
Mhm.
was like full immersion, living with Indian families and experiencing the Indian church. It was life changing for me. And then just some of the places where our organization worked that I've been in the last few years. Went to Iraq several times, Democratic Republic of Congo
I've been
multiple
there.
times. Oh yeah, what part have you been to?
Um, Great. Now I'm going to forget the name of the city. I don't
Is it,
remember.
which part of the country was it in?
I want to say it was like Easter, or like mid-Eastern, maybe.
Yeah, that's kind of where a lot of aid organizations
Wait,
kind of have.
Uvira, is that a city?
That sounds right. I
It was a
right.
while ago. I obviously.
Showing our geographic ignorance. Yeah, there's a big chunk of the eastern part of the country, where there's still a lot of conflict and movement of
Yeah,
refugees.
it was definitely there's a lot always going on there.
Right. Yeah, I think they counted something like 200 militia groups in that area still operating. Got to spend quite a bit of time in Liberia as well, and did, the region I was mostly responsible for was our staff working in Africa, and so got to go visit several countries there. South Sudan, spent a little bit of time there, and so I've lost count, and it was great. Like it was a really incredible experience, and I'm so grateful for it. And also, I think it's the kind of work you do for a season, and
Yeah.
then take a break and hand it over to younger, more energetic.
I feel like you probably have so many things you could write about. Like that's another book. Yeah, that's the next one.
Well, I will say that it was kind of tricky, because I thought when I first started to experience my own personal losses, I was like, I'm prepared for this because I have borne witness to other people suffering,
Mm,
and I'm kind of a trauma care practitioner in some ways. It's like I know how to do like psychological first aid and all this stuff. So I was like, I'm ready. I'm ready for this. And then I woke up the next morning and I was like, it's different when it's your own life,
mm,
It's just, and it made me have more respect for the people who I who I encountered that had, lost their homes or lost family members in war or conflict. And it just quadrupled by a million. I mean, my respect for them, because it just kind of, it made them even more human to me in some ways. In my mind, it's like, it's easy to see the people you serve as just they're beneficiaries. They're beneficiaries, and I'm serving. And it's like, oh, this is a little bit of what they were feeling. And it just, yeah, it changed how I view the work in a lot of ways when I kind of experienced my own crisis.
Would you say, and I'll probably read this once I read the book, but how was your faith like shaken, or, through this, was it shaken? What was going on with your faith and your relationship with God during all of this loss?
So I would say at first I was really disappointed in my faith. Um, and then that changed over time. But the thing that disappointed me was, I thought that if I did all the right things, if I had my theology of suffering all systematized and squared away, and if I was praying for peace and praying for comfort, and I had other people praying for peace and praying for comfort, and I was reading all the Christian grief books and all that stuff, that I thought that I would feel better, if that makes sense. Like, I thought the uncomfortableness of the grief would somehow be
Mm-hmm.
alleviated, and it just wasn't. And I was like, God, what is this like peace that passes all understanding? Where's that? What's it like? I, where is that? And I think what I had to learn is that the comfort isn't, there's, the scripture passage that says we'll comfort one another with the comfort we've been given. That word for comfort is kind of an off translation in the English. It more means, it's not so much palliative. Like, we think comfort as being like, I will feel better, my
Right.
emotional experience will improve. But the word really means more to fortify, to strengthen, which is different. It's not. And so that I think is what I learned, is that, okay, God's not going to necessarily make me feel better. This is going to hurt. This is going to be emotionally difficult, emotionally uncomfortable for a long time. But what he did do is fortify me, and somehow gave me the strength to bear it. And not just the strength. I over time, I saw him grow me in wisdom. I felt a very powerful reality of him leading me and nudging me towards, like, you need to speak to this person. They're going to offer you some wisdom.
Mhm.
You need to do this right now, because this is going to be something that's going to be helpful to you. Things that I couldn't have really come up with on my own. I felt like God was, and the image I have is him just kind of pushing me forward with his hand. And that felt very, very real. Experientially, it's one of the most real encounters I feel like I've had with God, but it wasn't emotionally comforting, to be completely
Mhm.
honest with you. And maybe other people do experience that. Like, maybe this was just something I had to walk through. But I think I'm just learning that we might have, we often have this idea that our Christianity might not give us, prosperity and wealth or prosperity and health, but it is going to give us emotional prosperity. Is like this
Mhm.
emotional prosperity gospel. Like, my faith's going to make me feel better. It's going to, I'll be happy. I'll be comforted. I'll have,
Yeah, that's a really good point.
right. And I just learned, no, well, you don't. Life is hard. The
Yeah,
world is cruel, and life is hard, and God will fortify you to bear up under it.
yeah,
So I
yeah,
think that's kind of how my faith evolved through all of it.
yeah. That's such a good word there about emotional prosperity. Okay, so I want to ask you about some of these rituals that you found in other cultures, because I feel like we don't really have those here. We have
Yeah.
funerals and stuff, but we don't,
Yeah.
like, have some of these things that you've probably researched. So tell me about some of those interesting things you found, and why you think those rituals are actually, to go back to the word comforting in
Yeah.
time of tragedy.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, it might help to say, I think the reason we've lost a lot of these rituals is, um, you know, we used to care for the sick and the dying at home.
Mm,
And, like in the 1870s, there were like 200 hospitals in this country. And, in 50 years, like by, the 1940s or 50s, there were 6,000. So it's like we went from like, we do care for the dying at home, we outsource it to hospitals. And while the hospital industry was growing, the funeral industry was growing as well. And so it used to be that when someone would die, they'd die at home. Neighbors, friends would prepare the body for burial. They would carry the body to burial. They would bury the family member in the church, in the churchyard where they went to church with their, with their pastor, with their rector. And so now we've gotten to this point where we've outsourced a lot of these practices around death and dying to hospitals, to funeral directors, to undertakers. And so I think when you're caring for death in your own space of living, it's not in this sanitized setting of the hospital.
yeah.
You have to have rituals to help you process it.
Right.
And obviously culture's kind of amalgamating now, and you have, culture's being diluted. A lot of rituals found their origin in some superstitions. And so the more kind of scientifically minded we get, we lose some of those superstitions. So we've lost the
Right.
rituals. But the reason why I think these rituals are so important. So the one, I'll just tell you about the one that really attracted my attention first, is Irish keening. So keening is this practice of, someone dies, they die at home, and the tradition is to stay up all night with the body, as kind of holding vigil over the body, and all of the neighbors and the whole community would come into the home where the body was and sit and wait through the night with the body. And while this was going on, women would come and lead the whole community in a time of wailing, like crying, screaming, singing. And these women, they were called Bain Quenta in the original language, but it means the lead keener or the lead crier. And they actually served as midwives in the community as well. So they kind of ushered people into the world and ushered people out. And so the women would come and they would just start moaning, and then everyone would join in the moaning. And sometimes they would sing songs, like words as tribute to the person that died, but they were never recorded or written down because they were meant to be improvised songs in tribute to the person that died. And it just gave everyone in the room permission to just fall apart, to completely
Mhm.
fall apart, which we don't really do publicly now. Like if I were to just completely lose it at a funeral, people would say she's not okay. Whereas
Yeah.
I think in Irish culture, in previous centuries, they would say, what, you're not okay if you're not wailing. Like it's not okay to
Right.
not wail. Totally appropriate to be wailing right now. And so it was just this communal release where we give ourselves permission to be vulnerable and authentic and process together. And so, and then they would stay up all night, they'd wail, and then the keeners would ride with the body to the funeral, to the burial until they were actually buried. And so, that was kind of an example of a ritual. I thought, man, how helpful and therapeutic was that experience, for people, and why don't we do that now? There are other traditions about, just the way people would wash the body, or the way that people would dress the body, that we don't really have now because we outsource that to
Right.
somebody else. Some other, I looked at some Jewish traditions. I have a friend named Shelley who's Jewish and grew up in Israel and told me about some of their traditions. Sitting Shiva, which is where, people come for 7 days after the death of a loved one. They will come and visit the grieving family for 7 days and just be with you. They'll take care of all of your needs, and there's no expectations that the mourning family host. People just come and visit and comfort and share stories and sweep their floor and clean their bathroom and just take care of everything. And so instead of squeezing it into a 2-hour visitation like we do now, it's kind of spread out over this 7-day period. So
Yeah.
things like that just really, uh, yeah, said, kind of told me that what we've done is truncate the grieving process as much as we can, and said,
Mhm.
let's quick do the visitation, quick do the funeral, expect people to get back to normal. And I think that the DSM says that if you're still having kind of a strong emotional reaction to grief at like 6 weeks, it's pathologized at that point. It's like, well, now you have a mental health disorder,
Oh,
like anyone who's grieved knows that the grieving process can take a lifetime, and there's nothing wrong with you. It's just, that's just a normal reaction to death.
yeah. Well, I think, yeah. And I think sometimes it's hard for people to like believe that something like the ritual, the Irish ritual, or even the Shiva, um, oh, is that really going to help? Like, you
Yeah.
don't really think it's going to, but if you don't try it, you don't know. And so
Yeah.
we don't know what we've lost by like you say, truncating the death process, which is so true. I'd never thought about the outsourcing thing, about how it's all hospitals and funeral directors and, make the call, do the thing. And I don't know what that does to us, like as people, that, or what it does to the grief process. How does that affect it long term? Did you analyze that?
Well, I think the reason it seemed powerful to me is that I think that, so like when you've had this kind of disorienting experience of losing someone, you're supposed to everyone's like, we need to process your grief, or you need to do the grief work. That's a term that Freud gave us, but he never really, I don't think he explained well what grief work is, at least not for the layman. I've tried to
Yeah.
understand it. You're like, okay, what do I need to do? What am I supposed to be doing to process this? And what I love about a ritual, it's the same thing I love about liturgy and worship. When you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do, maybe your faith is floundering. We've individualized faith so much in this culture, and we've individualized grief. It's you're
Hmm.
leave people alone in their grief. They need to grieve privately, and I understand where some of that comes from. But we weren't meant to do faith in isolation. We weren't meant to grieve in isolation. And what a ritual gives you is, it's almost like, I've heard it described as an empty vessel that you can kind of put whatever it is that you need into it. It walks you through kind of the physical experience of processing grief. So, tolling a bell, for example, that's a ritual I write about. It's like when someone dies, they used to toll the bell for the number of times that, or that they'd ring, one ring for every year that the person was alive. And it called the whole community together to know that someone had died. Or another ritual I write about is telling the bees. I don't know if you've heard of telling the bees, but it was this idea that if someone in the household died and they had beehives, that you had to go and put the bees in mourning. So you had to drape black cloth over the beehives and tell the bees that someone had died, or else the superstition was that the bee would fly away. The bees would fly away, or the bees would die. My husband's a beekeeper, so I was really
Oh,
interested,
wow.
yeah, in
That's
that ritual.
cool.
But it kind of just gives you a list of things to do that kind of roots you in the reality of what's happened. And it gives the community around you a script, a list of things to do. It's like, someone's died. What are we supposed to do? Well,
Yeah.
we're going to pull the bell. We're going to tell the bees. We're going to cover the mirrors. We're going to bake. I wrote a lot about different funeral foods. These are the foods we're going to cook. These are the foods we're going to eat. We're going to visit the grieving family. We're going to say these things. We're going to do these things. We're going to wail together. I write about funeral games. There are lots of traditions that have games that people would play at funerals as kind of an emotional release. So just, instead of just sitting around and thinking, what am I supposed to do now? You're actually kind of given a to-do list, which
Yeah,
to me roots you in your body.
I
It gets the
agree.
community involved in the same way that liturgy, when you show up at church and you're like, I'm not feeling it, God. It's like, here's a time-tested script that generations have used, phrases and words and songs that they've used to glorify God. Take that and apply that, and until your body kind of catches up with your heart, if that makes sense. And I just found that to be really helpful. So now I've started. I mean, you can't really, some of these rituals you can't resurrect because they're a
Yeah.
little strict. Yeah, like I'm probably not going to go tell our bees what happened to me this year.
Yeah.
Um, but I've recognized the importance of going to the graveside of my grandmother, of my sister, of recognizing the days that I lost my babies,
Mhm.
and finding some way to do that, and bringing people along with me to do those things. And I've found it actually helps. It helps,
Yeah.
it roots you in the reality of what's happened, and honors your grief and makes space for it,
That makes so much sense. And, I will just say that I think about like potential grief a lot, because I have lived this life where I haven't had to do it very much. Like, I've had, two very close to me grandmothers die, but not a parent, not a sibling, not a friend, um, nothing with my kids. And so I, I think having this information, because eventually there's going to be something, for
True.
everybody.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, I don't know, I pray about it a lot, because I'm like, okay, like, I don't really know how I would respond, if something
Yeah.
happened. Um,
Yeah.
but knowing that kind of a thing is good. And also just, I guess, just believing that God's going to provide what you need when you need it.
I think that's so true. And I wish that is my one hope I have for the book, is that it would maybe prepare people who haven't grieved. Because you're super normal, Erica. Like, it's really normal in this day and age for people to, some people get well into their 30s and 40s before they ever even go to a funeral. I
Yeah,
think that's another reason we've lost a lot of our
that's
rituals.
true.
Death,
That's weird.
death feels uncommon, even though it is the most common thing. It's kind of like childbirth, right? It's
Yeah.
like when you do it, you're like, this is a
Um,
miracle
yeah.
of feat of human existence. They should write about me in the history books for centuries. What I just did. It's like, but it's like, well, everybody was born. It's like the most
Yeah.
uncommon common thing. And so I think that's another reason we've lost our rituals, is because, childhood mortality used to be like 50%,
That's
50%.
true. That's true.
And so kids were exposed to death. It was happening in the home. Like, death was just part of life. And now it's like it's seen as abnormal when it happens. And it's
That's
like,
true. That's
not.
so interesting. I
So
never thought about that.
yeah, I just wish that we did more preparation for grief, because then when it does happen, it's not just like, oh, I'm devastated to lose this person. There's this sense in which you've been violated that I'm not sure people in the past have felt, because they expected it to happen. Whereas for me, I'm like, how dare you, God? How dare you let
Yeah.
someone? That's not supposed to happen.
Right.
And I just wish that we would educate ourselves, maybe even within the church family context, to say, this is what it means to mourn, to grieve. This could happen to you at any time. Life is still super precarious. If nothing else, COVID showed us that you never know what's going to happen. And here are some things that you can do to prepare. You're never fully prepared for it, but there are ways that you can kind of mentally, I guess, equip
Yeah.
ourselves spiritually, communally for these
Yeah,
things.
definitely. I mean, I think that is one reason, like, for someone that hasn't been through it, to read a book like yours, because it's certain to come for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned church family, and I do want to touch on that because that's really important in my work. And
Yeah.
I told you I wanted to ask you about your Twitter thread the other day, where you had asked people like to tell you about a pastor that had been influential in their life. And I found the question so refreshing in and of itself, because here we are, we hear about these big names that are like fallen, like it was just the Hillsong guy right now is the one. I don't know if you
Yeah.
even know that, but you hear these big leaders, and when that happens, when you see it's like all of a sudden, like the reputation of the church is like, you feel like it's on the line, or everyone is judging Christianity based on these people.
Right.
And I am always in my head like, they're just like visible, but there are so many wonderful people out there that you're never going to know their name, that are just doing diligent, faithful work within the local church where they are. And so I never want to not acknowledge the sin that is in these places, but I also want to really lift up those that are doing the good work. So, and then that thread was so great. All the answers were so great. So what made you ask that?
Well, I don't know that I could add any more to what you just said so well. Yeah, let's be clear. Failure within the church and failure among the people of God is nothing new. We shouldn't be shocked. The whole Bible is full of heroes who failed. There's like not a one of them that came out looking good,
So
that was
true.
perfect, and so the great thing about Twitter, social media is like, we're actually able to expose some of these abuses and hold people to account. So I never want to say that that's fully a bad thing. It's a really, really good thing. And yet for some reason, we are always drawn to these kind of salacious accounts of, utter failure on the part of religious leaders. And while that is happening, and we need to pay attention to it, you're absolutely right. There is so much beautiful, good work happening among churches. And I think of those just gentle, kind, faithful, hardworking shepherds, men and women that are leading the church and shepherding God's flock and being faithful to their families and being kind and listening and learning, and sacrificing. And they're never going to make headline news in the same way. I was thinking about when I went to Iraq, my mom was like, you can't go there because it's dangerous. Because all you ever see on the news about Iraq is,
Right.
The violence, and you don't see that, like, actually people are living their lives there. They love picnics in Iraq, harvest season, their holidays, their celebrations, the neighborly love that they you don't see any of that. You only see the bad news.
Such a
and
great comparison.
I just want to kind of push against this narrative a little bit that the church is somehow a pariah in culture, that it's bad for culture. Yes, absolutely. Like, spiritual abuse is a really, really powerful, evil, vile thing that needs to be held into account. But so many incredible ministries, education programs, food and feeding programs, AA meetings, grief share. So many awesome things are happening within the institution of the church. And we've got to celebrate those things. And I just think, man, the truth is what sets you free. And telling the truth means we need to tell the whole truth. So for a long time, the church only wanted to say the good things it was doing. It's really good that we're exposing some of the bad things so we can hold it into account. But let's not let the pendulum swing too far to this way. Let's tell the whole truth about what's going on in the church. Yes, there are problems. There are things we need to learn, sin we need to root out, abuse we need to eradicate. But there's also some just really, really incredible character development and service and mentoring and family and community that's happening within the church, even in this country, much less around the world. And we've got to tell that story too,
Yeah. I love that example. Because the church is like, I think there's something like 300,000 churches in the United States. So
Yes.
that's a lot to base all opinion on, the leader of a couple of them.
Right. Yeah. And those the failures are always going to get the headlines. You know what I mean? And again, there's something really good about that, about us knowing and exposing those things. But right now it just feels like, man, rage is the virtue we're all tapping into right now. And it's like, the more anger you feel, the more virtuous you feel in some ways. And there's
I can see that.
Place for holy, righteous indignation. There is a place for that. It's important. I actually write about it in the book. But there's also a place for joy and a place for peace and a place for thankfulness. And Rachel, my sister, was really good about that, like the Eshet Heil, woman of valor, that she tried to kind of normalize, where, hey, let's celebrate when we do good things. Let's celebrate when we show bravery and courage and service and do hard things for one another. Let's recognize it and celebrate it together. And it's the bride of Christ. She's not perfect, but she's also Christ's bride. So let's just be tender with her.
Yeah.
And you got to be both. You got to be tender. You got to be honest. It has to be both.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, Amanda, thank you so much. Before you go, though, I want to ask you what you're reading, or if you have any book recommendations or podcasts that you're listening to. I love to get these recommendations from people.
Yeah. Well, I just read The History of Sunday by Justo Gonzalez, and I was really interested. I think one thing, we're talking about the church, it's like, the church for a long time has done a few things really well. They have gathered together to sing, pray, study the word, and share bread, food together, share a meal, and serve the marginalized. that's what they've done really well for 2,000 years. And this book kind of covers kind of how Christians have gathered together on a weekly basis for years. Justo Gonzalez is just one of my favorite church historians. He writes in a way that's readable, but super informative. So he's like academic writer that is good for people that have short attention spans like me. That's been really good. Podcasts that I'm listening to. I love The Holy Post with Phil Vischer and Sky Jatani and Christian and Caitlin. Like that, I just love hearing their take on kind of what's happening in evangelicalism and how we ought to respond. And so that's a podcast that I listen to pretty regularly. And of course, love Kate Bowler. Everything Happens.
Oh yeah.
She's been, I think, a good leader in terms of speaking honestly about pain. And now I'm listening to your podcast. I'm really love really your important work about finding that balance between mothering and creative work and being faithful to the Lord and tending to your own spiritual needs. So Emily Freeman, The Next Right Thing, I've been listening to that. I've been enjoying that a lot. So
she's great. She's like a bomb. Like you listen to her voice and you're just like
I know there is something about her voice and I'm like, I'm gonna put this on right before I go to sleep.
So calming.
Like dreaming, yeah. And one other book I want to mention, I just got the book This Here Flesh by Cole Arthur Riley. She's the person behind Black Liturgies, and man, talk about some exquisite writing. So I'll give her a plug too. I've just started it. It just came in the mail.
Awesome.
But.
Yes, I love getting those recommendations. Like my favorite part of the podcast. So where can people get your book they can probably pre-order now.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, it's you can pre-order it in most places where you can buy books, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram. I don't know. I've kind of stayed off of Twitter a little bit. I don't know. You have to go. It's like
an interesting place.
It's super intense. I think I tweeted one time something like, I don't really enjoy Word, or like, I'm not doing Wordle. I don't know. What's the big hype? And it was like, the Vultures came out. It's like, they're just, I'm scared to talk about
Wordle at all. So I just see it and I'm like, that looks like a dumb game. I have no interest.
Well, Sarah Bessie convinced me to do it. And I actually do love Wordle, but there's some things I've learned to tweet about, like don't tweet about deconstruction, like don't tweet about Wordle. But so I am on Twitter some, but I'm on Instagram too, Amanda Held Opelt. I'd love to I love meeting people that are walking through grief and walking through kind of rethinking their faith after a disorienting life event, and love to hear people's stories. So find me there and share what you're going through. And I'd love to connect. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thanks, Erica. It's been